This is Winchester Academy.
Thank you for that really nice introduction. I don't want you to go to sleep, but I do want the lights off up here. I got half my title correct. I've been really preoccupied this last year with a new NASA mission that one of my teams and I just got a huge grant to start preparing. And so I messed up my title and put exploring exoplanets because that's what this mission is going to do. And but I do care about life in the universe. That's really the motivation for me in my whole career. And in fact, I started out with SETI when I was just in grad school, starting my PhD dissertation. I wanted to do life in the universe, and I met this really interesting woman named Jill Tarter, who was running the SETI Institute in California at the time. And just before I met her, I saw the movie Contact. How many people have seen that movie? How many people have not seen that movie? Well, I really strongly advocate to go see that movie or just rent it and watch it at home. But the thing is, if you rent it and watch it at home, you have to remove all the distractions and just sit down and watch the movie from the beginning, because the opening sequence is like one of the most important parts of that movie. And there's almost no sound like for the first minute and a half. And when I went to go see that movie, I was an undergrad at UW in Madison, but I was doing a summer internship just that summer at Harvard, and that's when that movie came out. And I was so smart, like that was the smartest I've ever been in my whole life. I really, it's been a downhill slide since then, but at that point, I knew it. I knew how smart I was. And so I went to see this movie with the idea that I was gonna know all the things that were wrong about it. Like, oh, it's another science movie. They're gonna just mess up all these things. And within about 10 seconds of watching it, I was like, oh, this and that is wrong and blah, blah, blah. But by the end of the movie, I was like standing on my chair, yelling, this is what I'm supposed to do with my life. And I was totally preoccupied with this, wanting to find life on other planets. And it was such a well-done movie, and it was actually based on the real-life experience of this woman named Jill Tarter, who I had never met before. This is a story that Carl Sagan wrote, who, it's fiction, obviously, because in the movie she does make contact with aliens and then interacts with them. But the real life part of it really is based around her experience with trying to get a program to search for life elsewhere off the ground here. And so a year later, I'm working with her in her office, right? Like this all just happened. And I didn't even put it all together in my mind until towards the end of the summer. I'd been working on developing this new catalog. I really wanted to have a catalog of all the stars that were in our neighborhood that could potentially support life as we know it. There's a lot of things about the stars that can be bad for life. But the sun is kind of a special star, and there's a lot of stars out there, and some of them could be good for life as we know it. And those are the places we should search, I thought, for signals, alien technological signals, planets like the Earth, anything that would get us a little closer to exploring the local neighborhood for other life forms. So I've been doing this all summer. And I'm sitting there by myself because Jill, as usual, is off at some meeting somewhere. In that particular meeting, she was in Hawaii. And I was thinking to myself, I should be in Hawaii because I'm the one who is doing all the work. And also, I need to talk to all the other people at this meeting and ask them these questions, and she doesn't understand the questions I'm trying to ask, and she's asking the wrong people, and I should be there and not here. And so I'm complaining in my mind. And then at that moment, I look over at my desk, and there's this picture sitting there of Jill Tarter, my boss, who is not there, not with me, and Jodie Foster in front of the Arecibo telescope. And at that moment, I suddenly realized that the movie was based on her, and I was sitting in her office preparing a target list to search for signs of intelligent life elsewhere in the universe that could take us to just our whole civilization in a whole new direction. I mean, it's a long shot, but wow, if it actually works. So after that, it was no more complaining. I just did my work, and I ended up doing my whole PhD based on that, and it eventually expanded to include developing missions to try to find planets like the Earth around nearby stars and actually build the kinds of cameras that would be able to see those planets and start to be able to tell what they're made of. Could they be habitable like our own planet? Would they have water on them? And maybe even start to see some signs of life. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm not going to say anything more about SETI and signals unless you have questions about that at the end. I'm happy to talk about it. But I've been so obsessed with finding Earth-like planets around the nearby star systems that that's kind of what made it into my talk tonight. And in particular, there is a mission now that has just entered phase A. And in NASA speak, when a mission enters phase A, that means it's real. Congress has put the stamp of approval on it, and now we get to start building it. And phase A is what we call the formulation phase, where the scientists and the engineers have to get together in a room many times, and the scientists have to say, this is what we want to do. And then the engineers say, that's totally impossible, but what you could do is this. And then the scientists say, well, that's not good enough. Could we do that and a little bit of this? And it has to be this back and forth. And sometimes the engineers come back and they say, you know, we don't think you're thinking big enough, because did you know that we can do this? And we're like, no, we didn't know we could do that. So it's a push and a pull, and we all share the goal of building the most fantastic mission possible within the dollar amount that has been allocated and approved. So it's a really interesting kind of experience for me. This is the first time that one of my teams has been asked to lead the development of a real NASA mission. I've gotten so accustomed to talking about future missions and future concepts and things we could do in 10 or 20 years, that now that I'm working on this mission and it's real, sometimes I find myself having to remind my team members that, did you know this is a real mission? Like, I understand you have other meetings to go to, but this is a real mission. This isn't just the imaginary ones that we're used to working on. You should come, you should show up and prioritize this. So, and I even have to remind myself, oh my gosh, this is a real mission. Don't just, have other things to do first. So, but this is the Wide Field Infrared Survey Telescope, WFIRST. And we're lucky because a bunch of stuff happened in the last couple of years that made this a total surprise. This wasn't even on the radar, certainly not for me, just even 4 years ago. And now it's a real mission in phase A. How does something like that even happen? Well, I'll tell you how it happened. So NASA is an organization that gets its money allocated to it by Congress and does not have an infinite amount. And every 10 years, all the scientists get together and they advise NASA on what they think the most important thing is to do. And in 2010, the scientists said to NASA, you should invest in something that can find planets like the Earth around nearby stars. You should try to find the first signs of a habitable planet nearby. That's really important. And also you should do all these other things that aren't anywhere near as exciting as that. But you should at least put a tiny little bit amount of money into finding living planets around nearby stars. And of course I'm thinking, that's the only thing you should be doing. Like, who cares about all this other stuff? Like, everybody wants to find life on other planets. So around that time, the National Reconnaissance Office, which has many telescopes at its disposal, they're not looking outward into space, they're looking down at the Earth, found an extra space telescope in the closet that it didn't need. And every time I say that, I feel like it's a joke, but it's actually true. And it turns out, so it's identical to the Hubble Space Telescope. And it turns out that the Hubble Space Telescope, we didn't know this at the time, was one of a fleet of telescopes. And Hubble was the only one that was doing science and looking upward and outward into the universe. But they didn't all get used, apparently. So there's like sort of 1.5 of them left, and they're like a bunch of parts and then one big telescope left in the closet. And NASA was sort of looking for resources and not sure how to go down really new, bold, exciting paths without having very much more money to work with. And so the Defense Department gave NASA this telescope, and NASA said, well, what should we do with it? And all the astronomers said, we should do all these other boring things. And then a few astronomers said, and we could also look for habitable planets around nearby stars. And so it wasn't actually approved to look for habitable planets around nearby stars. All the boring stuff was like, yeah, that's the good, solid, reliable science, we're going to do that. But you know what, as a tech demo, just as a technology demonstration to sort of feel out how we might do this, we're going to let you put a camera on this telescope in space to see if you can find planets around the very nearest stars and take pictures of them for the first time. So this would like totally galvanize the whole community of scientists that wants to try to find planets around other stars. And now we have this mission, and we are happy to be piggybacking as a tech demo, whatever you want to call it. Like, we're there, and we are going to do everything we can to try to find new worlds that are very nearby to like the nearest star systems to the sun. So that is a slide transition that you really only want to use one time. So I like to begin just like with reminding ourselves where we live. This is our planet. Does anybody recognize this image, where it was taken and who took it? This is actually the first picture of the fully illuminated Earth ever taken from space by the Apollo astronauts. I think it was Apollo 11. And I have to remind myself every time what it was. But this was so exciting, right? I mean, these guys, they were on their way to the moon, and it was the first time in all of their journeys that the alignment was just right. So the spaceship was just right in between the Earth and aligned with the sun, so that when they looked back, they saw the fully illuminated Earth for the first time. And one of them snapped that picture, and when it came down, when it was downloaded, to Earth, transmitted back, there were 1 billion people who saw this for the first time, what their planet looks like, where they live. And it's so wonderful, because it's just this beautiful, colorful, bright world sitting there in just black, right? Just empty space. It's obviously a small and finite place, not just endless. So this picture sparked off a whole environmental awareness kind of movement in the United States, certainly, but all over the world. I mean, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, many changes and many changes of thinking began with the downloading of this image and really just seeing how small of a world we live on. So culturally speaking, this is a really important image. This is the most replicated image right here in the history of humanity. There's no other image that has been used as many times as this one has been. It's a really special picture. And I just think of, you know, a billion eyes opening into the reality, to the vision of what our world really looks like from afar. As a scientist, I look at that and I see a really a world that is totally different from all the other planets in our solar system. It's dynamically, the atmosphere is active, there's climate, there's seasons, there's seasonal change that is occurring. The planet looks dramatically different from month to month. And there are a lot of complex relationships that are keeping the planet looking like this. This planet has been habitable to life as we know it for about the last 3.5 billion years at least. So something is keeping this system healthy and going. And I see a lot of signals in here too. I see clouds, I see ground cover, vegetation, I see desert, I see water, I see the reflection of the sun off of the water. These are all things that you could potentially detect on another planet from very far away, just because of the color of the light that it's reflecting and the change in the light as the planet spins. So I see a lot of different things when I look at this picture, and I think it's a really important image to keep in mind. And you know, here we are, like, can you ever really be alone on a planet like this? We've always asked the question as astronomers, are we alone? But here we are on this world, and I just, you know, we're so little, and I'm going to give you a little tour of the rest of the neighborhood here, but I like to point out that there are more living organisms on this one planet than there are stars in the entire universe. Not just our galaxy, but the entire universe. I mean, this planet is filled with life. It's an amazing place. So let's stand on the ground and look up. Here is our nighttime sky. And if you see, what happens if I, oh yeah, you can see my cursor here maybe. Right now I'm pointing out a little patch of fuzz right here. That is important. Does anybody know where that is? What's that? That is the Andromeda Galaxy. I'm going to zoom in on that in a second. And of course, what is this? That is the Milky Way. In northern Wisconsin, we're so lucky we get to see this all the time, as long as there isn't like a full moon blazing away or something. But this is, you know, of course, I just made a little red box up here, and if we zoom in on that, you know, that's all stars, just stars, stars, stars. 400 billion stars in our own galaxy, and every single one of them is different from all the other ones. These dark lanes and patches that you see, that's not because there aren't stars there, it's because there's dust and gigantic clouds of dust and gas in the galaxy, and that's what new stars form out of. They're continually forming new stars, and in the galaxy, about on average, 1 new star per year comes out of all that material. It's kind of like clouds and raindrops. And there's the Andromeda. We zoom in on that. That's our neighbor galaxy. This is not one of our own stars, but this is a galaxy in its own right. And this is kind of our sister galaxy. The Milky Way, our own galaxy, looks a lot like this, and of course we're inside of it. But the Andromeda Galaxy also has about 400 billion stars in it. And this galaxy is actually headed straight for us. So, you know, several billion years, give it several billion years, and the Milky Way Galaxy and the Andromeda Galaxy will collide. And when that happens, you know what, it probably won't even matter. Most of those stars are so small, and there's so much empty space between them that even if you take 2 galaxies like this and collide them, I mean, it's really spectacular to see what happens. We have examples of this going on elsewhere in the universe. But no 2 stars will ever collide. I mean, that's very rare. They just pass right through each other. There's so much empty space between the stars. They're very far apart compared to how big they are individually. Another view of the nighttime sky. This is familiar, I know. How many people have seen the thin crescent moon just a couple days after new moon, where you can actually make out the dark part of the moon too? You can see it lit up. Does anybody know why you can see that part even though the sun is not shining on it? That's the Earthshine. So the Earth itself is shining on this part of the moon and lighting it up. That is why you can see that part of the moon, plus this little thin crescent. So if you were standing on the moon looking back at the Earth, you would see an almost fully illuminated Earth, except for a tiny little crescent that would be dark. So it's the exact opposite, phases. And that part of the light that's shining on the moon, that has helped us a lot in our efforts to design a new camera to search for Earth-like planets around other stars, because that light coming from the Earth, every part of the Earth is shining on the moon right there. And the color of the light that's reflecting back to us is exactly what you would expect to see if you were looking at the Earth from very far away. And you might not be able to make out continents or oceans or whatever, but all the light added up together, that is the color of the light that we see reflecting off of the moon. So we've actually studied that quite a bit. Okay, and then if you had really good eyes and you could see the Andromeda Galaxy, this is about how big it would be in the sky compared to the size of the full moon. So that's big, that's not nothing right there. You could really see that. Because our eyes are not big enough and we can't collect enough starlight in our eyes at once, we just sort of see that as a faint little fuzz, and most people don't even notice it, but that is how big it would be. Okay, so now what I've done, this is actually a new slide. I made a little tiny red box appear, and it's about the size of the lunar maria, the dark patches on the moon from ancient lava flows, but it's about that size, appeared just now on the sky. And if we zoom in on that little patch of sky, this is what we would see. So astronomers, when Hubble was launched, they had a special key project. And the key project was to take a picture of a tiny little patch of sky, this big, and it had to be a special patch of sky that had no stars in it, no stars that were known. And why would you want to take a picture of a totally empty tiny little patch of sky? Well, they wanted to see what was there. So they took Hubble and they stared at this tiny little patch of sky for 10 days. And what came back was this, like just packed with stuff. And none of it is in our own galaxy. This is a zoom in. There actually are only, I could find 1, 2, 3 stars in this picture. I can tell because they're unresolved and I can see the diffraction spikes from the telescope itself. All the rest of the stuff in here these are not stars in our own galaxy, these are galaxies of their own. Okay, so each one of these is a galaxy that has hundreds of billions of stars in it, very far away, far outside the reaches of our own galaxy. And this is all, to remind you, this is all in this one little tiny patch of sky. And it doesn't matter which direction. We've done this again in different directions. It doesn't matter. You see the same sort of thing. They are different galaxies, obviously, but they are just, the whole universe is filled with galaxies like ours, as far as can be seen. So the universe has as many galaxies, the observable universe has as many galaxies in it as we have stars in our one galaxy. So 400, 500 billion galaxies in the visible universe, and hundreds of billions of stars in each one. And yet, there are more living organisms on planet Earth than there are stars in the entire universe. So just setting the stage here. And when we look at these stars, we ask ourselves, so stars are important, right? Because as far as we know, that's where life lives. We have our sun, and the only reason we aren't a frozen ball of ice is because the sun is shining, and the Earth is pretty close to the sun in the grand scheme of things, and keeps warm because of sunlight. So there's, the idea is that the universe is actually very cold. I mean, it's only 3 degrees above absolute zero, and that is not a habitable environment for life to carry out metabolism and have a flow of energy. But stars are these little furnaces that keep their local environment warm, and so planets around them can have life forms, and trees, and hydrothermal vents, and weather systems and climates that are stable over billions of years. So these are the homes, but every star is different from every other star. So the question is, what are they really like? And how can we sort out which stars are the good ones to search for life as we would understand it? It's not to say that life can't take hold in lots of different kinds of environments, but step one is search for what you know you can recognize, or you think you can recognize. So the idea is that every star potentially has a habitable zone around it. And it's just the area around the star where the temperature is about right to have liquid water. It seems that every living organism on Earth requires some liquid water. It can't be frozen water, it can't be vapor water, it has to be liquid water. It doesn't have to be a lot, but it has to be some. And so that means that the temperature has to be within a certain range. So with, above freezing and below boiling. And that means that only a certain place around the sun is good for planets that can have life on them. Around the sun, seems pretty clear that Venus is inside the it's too hot, right? But Mars, if Mars were a little bit larger and could have held on to its atmosphere longer, is potentially in the habitable zone. So we could have had 2 habitable planets, Earth and Mars, if you could swap Venus and Mars with each other in their orbit. Venus is about the same size as the Earth and does have a thick atmosphere. And you could imagine swapping those 2 and having Earth and Venus be comfortable planets and places for life to live. Other stars, though, have habitable zones in different places. So I'm just showing 3 examples here. So there are faint stars, there are stars like the sun, and then there are really luminous, bright luminous stars. And this seems like it's such a simple little graphic. Like, obviously, if a star is fainter than the sun, it's going to have a habitable zone that's closer to it, right? You need to huddle closer in order to stay warm. And if the star is more luminous and brighter than the sun, well, then your hab zone is going to have to be further away so you don't fry. And that is true, but there's a lot more going on here, actually. So the more luminous stars in the galaxy, they use up their fuel so quickly that they will explode, and they will run out of fuel and swell up into red giants and explode before the planets are even done forming. Like, they just don't live very long. So when you look at a galaxy like the Andromeda, these really luminous, bright stars are mostly what you are seeing because they're giving off most of the light in the galaxy. There's not as many of them as there are small stars, but they are so bright that that is what you're seeing the light from when you look at the Andromeda galaxy. But probably almost none of them have life around them because they are all young, very young, less than a billion, a few hundreds of millions of years old, which to a planet is not very long. And planets are not even done forming yet at that stage. Then you got all the suns, these yellow stars. Astronomers call them G stars for historical reasons that don't make any sense to anybody. But the sun-like stars are ones that are still fairly bright, but they live a long time. So the sun will live, 10 billion years. We're halfway through. And these are pretty good homes for life, as far as we know. I mean, we live around one, so it's at least possible. And then there are these guys. We call them red dwarfs. And they are by far the most numerous stars in the galaxy. You'll never see one. The very closest star to us is a red dwarf. Its name is Proxima Centauri. It's been in the news like crazy over the last couple of weeks because astronomers just discovered a planet around it in the habitable zone. And this is the very nearest star to us. You cannot see it with your eyes. It is hundreds of thousands of times too faint for you to see because those red dwarfs are just so faint. They're like, they're bigger than Jupiter, but they're definitely brighter than Jupiter. I mean, they do shine, but they're not that much bigger than Jupiter, and they're just little red dwarfs. So these guys are like sand, on the beach. They're just everywhere. The whole galaxy is filled with them. They account for probably 80% of the stars, but they hardly give off any light. The habitable zone where it's warm enough, is very close to the star. So the planet around Proxima Centauri that was just discovered and is in the habitable zone, it goes around its star once every 11 days. So we take 365 days to go around the sun, and we're in the hab zone. That planet takes 11 days because it's so close to the star. That is all well and good, but there's some problems with that. I don't think that red dwarfs are, well, maybe they can have life, but they have issues. So when you're that close to your star, what'll happen is that the planet can become tidally locked to the star. So you know how the moon is, we always see the same face of the moon. That is because the moon is tidally locked to the Earth. So the moon isn't perfectly round. It's got a little, a little offset, a little heavier on one side than the other. And so that side is always facing us. And if the moon were farther away, that wouldn't happen. But being so close, we only see the one side of the moon. The same thing will happen with planets going around M-stars. One side is always daytime, and one side is always nighttime. And what happens is that on the daytime side, with that blistering sun always overhead at noon all day long, it's like all the water evaporates, goes up into the atmosphere, flows over to the nighttime side, and freezes out into a gigantic ice cap. And that just keeps happening until all the water is gone and it's all desert on one side and all ice on the other side. And then even the atmosphere itself just condenses on the cold side. And you end up with this stone and like a snow cone, like just one gigantic ski hill on one side and then just rock on the other. And some of my colleagues have tried to rescue these planets because M-stars are so common that it would be great if they could have life. It would really be a bummer if most of the stars in the galaxy could not have habitable planets. And so the way they rescue it is just by putting a thicker atmosphere on it with more carbon dioxide, and that redistributes the heat enough that you can keep it going, and you can maybe have like, an ocean world where there's, lots of ocean on one side and maybe more ice caps floating or icebergs floating on the other side, but it all stays with water, not just ice and nothing. So maybe it can be rescued. But the other thing about these M-stars that annoys me is that they have massive flares. They're very active stars. So every once in a while, the sun will give off a doozy, just a nice big coronal mass ejection, a big flare. It'll wipe out a bunch of satellites, and everything has to be rebooted, and it can even take down power grids on the ground here. But that's once in a great while, and we're pretty far away from the sun, so we don't get the brunt of it. Mercury has a much worse time of it when that happens. But M-stars, these red dwarfs, they do this all the time. That's just their way of life. Flare, 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 all the time. And the habitable zone is so close to the star, you know, just imagine these flares reaching out and just singeing the surface of the planet over and over again. And not only that, but since the same side of the planet is facing the star all the time, you know, I don't know how you're going to get a whole lot of life going, at least on the near side of the planet. But I think it's interesting to me to think about, like, what if we just had daylight all the time on half of our planet and nighttime all of the time on the other half? Would we have anything close to life as we know it on Earth? Would you ever have a need for wings or legs or fins? Like, would you ever move? You would not migrate, right? Because everything's the same. Half of what makes life on Earth so interesting and adapted into so many diverse forms is the fact that things are changing. You know, we always have seasons, and life has to move and keep up to this and come up with these inventions for, you know, how to stay in the comfort zone. So many different kinds of stars, many different sizes of habitable zones. All of them are going to have planets that are in different kinds of orbits compared to ours. Many of them are going to have different kinds of behavior. This is a good flare coming off the sun, but it's not that uncommon, but nothing like red dwarfs. The size of the Earth, by the way, in this picture would be like about the size of my cursor here. So these are really big, nice flares. I have, for fun, a video of the sun, and just to add interest, I put music to it, and I'm going to play it for you now. This is just this is going to help sort of portray how the Earth, or how the sun looks at different colors of light. So we're going to start out looking at the sun with just how you would see it with your eyes, which is fairly featureless. It's just a round ball. But then, and you might see a star spot or two. But then it's going to change wavelengths, and it's going to go into the ultraviolet and the X-ray, and you're going to see more and more how those flares pop out. This is actually an ultraviolet image right here, so you can really see those flares coming off. But I'll stop talking and let you watch. So I'm going to pause that. I think that this is like the most spectacular view of the sun that I've ever been able to find. I mean, how many people knew that the sun looked like this? How many people did not know that the sun looked like this? This is not just a little ball, suspended in space, right? This is a spectacular part of creation, and all of the stars are like this, right? I mean, they all have slightly different behavior, but they all are interesting like this. And I wanted to show you, in particular, part of this that is relevant to what we're trying to do when we are searching for planets around other stars. So this picture right here, let me get a little more, there we go. This picture right here, this is actually from a mission that the European Space Agency flew called SOHO. It's a solar and heliospheric observatory. It's a space telescope. It's in orbit around the sun. And right here, what we're looking at, these beautiful, just beautiful wings around the sun, This is the corona that comes streaming off the surface of the sun out into space. And what they did was they took a little like metal disc and just put it in the camera to block out the sun because the sun is so bright. This allows you to see, it's like an eclipse. How many people have seen a solar eclipse, a full, total eclipse? That, I mean, you can really see once the moon finally gets in the right position and blocks out the sun, you can really see that beautiful corona around the sun, which you normally cannot see during the daytime because the sun itself is just so blindingly bright. But this is called a coronagraph because they put a little disc in here to block out the sun so you could see the corona. And there's another one here. Here's another one, a slightly wider field of view, so you can see it streaming off of here. All this stuff in the background, those are stars. And you can sort of see them going by in the background. This is because the observatory is in orbit around the sun. Those were 2 comets that just fell in. We'll see that again. Right there, those are 2 sun-grazing comets. There's a whole, I mean, we learned from this that there are whole families of comets that are sun-grazers that are occasionally falling into the sun. And you know, every once in a while, one of our own planets goes by too, and we see Venus, you know, going through, and Mercury is going through, and Mars, and Jupiter, and Saturn. You know, it's a very interesting view of our own solar system. Really special place. The other stars, meanwhile, they are like this too. They have that same kind of interesting behavior, and they have families of their own, and all of them are different. You know, some stars, like the sun is a single star. There's no other stars in our solar system, thankfully. It would be terrible if there was another star that just occasionally came swooping through on its orbit around the sun and, you know, removed all of the other planets from the solar system. That would be terrible. Or shined a lot of extra light on us at random times and, you know, we got baked by it. That would also be bad. Most of the stars in the galaxy are not single stars like the sun, so that's kind of interesting to think about. About half of the stars that you see when you look up are actually 2 stars or 3 stars. Some of them are in, you know, really complicated families of 4 or 5 stars. The very nearest star to us, Proxima Centauri, is actually part of a triple system. So we know it's possible for those stars to have planets. We just don't know what it means for the big picture. You know, and I was telling somebody at dinner tonight that on Earth, our planet didn't just form with all of its oceans on it. It formed, and then the oceans were delivered later through comets coming in and impacting the ground and leaving their water behind. So over time, the oceans were built up, but that water had to be delivered from farther out in the solar system. And that's partly thanks to Jupiter pulling that stuff in and throwing it into sun-grazing orbits into the inner parts of the solar system. So, you know, if we had another star in our solar system, not clear how that would work. I mean, all of that material might not be able to form or be delivered to planets that are in the habitable zone, very close to the stars themselves. But then again, maybe it's actually better for life to be in the binary system. That's what we call when there's 2 stars, because both of them can have planetary systems, and maybe if they get complex life going, they can talk to each other and have little, you know, weekend trips over to the other star system. It could be a lot of fun. But so each star is in a different sort of configuration with other stars, and even if it's a single star, it will have a different history. When our planets were forming, there were a lot of impacts. There was a giant impact with the Earth and another Mars-sized body that formed the Earth and Moon system. And then all the comet impacts I was talking about that brought the water here. that isn't going to happen the same way twice, right? That's not, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of stars in the universe, but each one of them is going to have its own unique history. And many of those histories might work for life as we know it, but you're not going to just find like an Earth twin out there. It's not going to happen exactly the same way twice. I like this picture right here because it was the artist's attempt to illustrate the whole entire history of the Earth in one picture. And the way it works is it kind of goes counterclockwise. So it starts over here with all these clouds of gas and dust in the Milky Way starting to form new stars, because they kind of form like in disks of gas and dust, and the planets condense out of that around each new star that's forming. And then as the planets gradually form, you have impacts with comets hitting the Earth and delivering water, and early on there's all these volcanoes and earthquakes and crazy stuff is happening, and there's a lot of exchange of material with the rest of the solar system, and eventually you get these little organic carbon-based molecules forming, and they're coming together and forming more and more complex structures, and RNA and DNA magically appears, and then you get your first little tiny cells, and they come together and they make little colonies, and eventually they form multicellular organisms, and somewhere along the line they get chlorophyll in them and start making oxygen in the atmosphere and kill everything off except for themselves. And then, though, because you have oxygen in the atmosphere, you can have even more complex life, and eventually it even grows like fins and legs and starts moving around and goes on land, and then gets really big and learns to fly, and you have pterodactyls and all these land plants, and then keep going up the road, and there's cave people with fire they discover, and they're fending off the lions over here, and then you drive up the highway to the top of the mountain where there's a vehicle with headlights and a little telescope and a radio telescope looking out into the universe and studying all that stuff and looking for other ones like itself. So I want to get into this search now for planets around nearby stars. And there's just one mission I want to tell you about that is nearing the end of its life. It changed absolutely everything for people who look for life and for planets around other stars, because it discovered thousands of planets. And it's a clever, simple little mission. And it's a space telescope like Hubble, but the difference is that it only stared at one little patch of sky. So I'm actually going to show that first. So it stared at a patch of sky about the size of the palm of your hand at arm's length, and it didn't look anywhere else. It just stayed suspended in space, also in orbit around the sun, suspended in space, pointed in that one direction for its entire 3-year lifespan. And it stared at this one patch, and that patch of stars was chosen because it's just a very richly packed part of the sky, as many stars as possible. So kind of the opposite of the Hubble project, where they were trying to stare at a tiny little patch of sky with no stars. This was chosen to have as many stars as possible in one field. So they stared at 100,000 stars for 3 years, and what they were looking for was changes in the brightnesses of those stars that would indicate planets passing in front of them and casting a shadow, blocking some of the light. This picture up here, I'm shocked that this is animated. I did not realize that would be animated. That's great. But I don't know if you can see that little dot moving across the face of the sun there. That's Mercury is passing in front of the sun. And if you were very far away, the sun would just look like a point of light. But when Mercury passed in front of it, it would look like a point of light that was a tiny little bit fainter than when Mercury was not in front of it. And same thing, here's Venus transiting, we call it a transit, transiting in front of the sun. So Kepler was watching all of these other stars for the same thing. It was just monitoring how bright they are. And some of them showed a little dip in their brightness for a few hours at a time, and that would happen every 6 months or every 10 days or every 3 weeks or something. And then they would be able to say, well, there's a planet in orbit around that star, and it's going around once every 10 days or every 3 weeks or every 6 months, whatever, however often they saw that shadow. This only works if the planetary system is edge on, you know, so that the planets do pass in front of the star from our point of view. This does not work if all the orbits are face on like this. So that's why Kepler had to look at so many stars, you know, to have some chance of catching the ones that are edge on. And boy, did it work. I mean, they found 4,000 planets. 1,000 of them have been followed up and confirmed, but they're all real. I mean, they're pretty much all real. There might be some instances where there's a binary star that kind of looks like a planet passing in front, but for the most part, these are all real. And they came back in all sizes. So we were expecting maybe, well, we didn't know what we were expecting. You know, Jupiter, bigger planets are easier to see. And so we hadn't really ever found any small planets up to that point. And what Kepler came back with was basically the smaller the planet is, the more of them there are. And these, you know, really small planets are hard even for Kepler to see. So this is, you know, these are Earth-sized planets here, 600-700 of them. Super Earths, something between Earth size and Neptune size, 1,000 of those, and then 1,500 Neptune planets, and then a bunch of Jupiters and super Jupiter planets were found. But this category right here, so there's more of these, right? There's a lot more of these out there that Kepler wasn't able to see because they're just too small. But this category of super Earths is new. That's not something that we really thought about before because we don't have anything like that in our own solar system. Turns out to be one of the most common types of planets out there, and we have no idea what they're like. Are they gaseous, like Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune? Are they rocky, like the Earth and Venus and Mars, or something in between? Don't know. A lot of theories, but not sure. So Kepler is good at measuring how big a planet is because it can see how big the dip is from the shadow of the planet. You just measure how big the planet is then. But we're not getting, you know, we don't know. I mean, Kepler can see how big the planet is, and it can see what the orbit is. You know, is it 3 weeks orbit? Is it 6 months orbit? And that tells you how far away from the star it is and what temperature it will be at. So a lot of those planets could be in the habitable zone of their stars. A lot of them look like they are in the hab zone of their stars. But we still can't like tell from that what they're really like. You know, do they have an atmosphere? Do they have water, clouds? Do they have plants, oceans, anything like that? That is gonna take a coronagraph. And this is where we wanna do what SOHO did for the sun. So this is now looking at the sun. And that SOHO mission, the European mission that put this disk in front of the sun, it's showing all the nice stuff coming off the sun, and you can see all the planets around the sun that you wouldn't normally be able to see because the sun is so bright. We want to do this for other stars now. We want to build a really way better coronagraph and block out the light of each individual star that we look at and see if we can see the light of planet, the little speck of light, the pale blue dot of another world orbiting another star. This would be an example of doing that. So this is just a simulation. It's not real. But this is what we want to be able to do. If we can build a really great coronagraph and actually see planets orbiting as close to the star as possible, then we might have a chance of actually finding Earth 2.0. The news, the media, the headlines, they are talking about Earth 2.0 every other week, it seems like. We have not found Earth 2.0 yet. I mean, we found planets that are the right temperature, but they're way too big, or they're the right size, but they're way too hot. That's just, or else they're Jupiter-type planets. So we have not found, it turns out that finding Earth, it's like a conspiracy because the Earth-like planets are the absolute hardest ones to find. They're very small and they're very close to the star. And so it's just getting right in that sweet spot where they're just right temperature and just the right size. All the different ways we have of looking for planets don't work. That's why we need to build a really good coronagraph. It's the only possible way. And if we do it and everything goes really well, what we will expect to see is a tiny little speck of light coming, and that's the planet. That's what we're going to have to work with. So this is actually the view of our own planet, the Earth, as seen by Voyager. Carl Sagan somehow miraculously persuaded NASA to turn Voyager around at the end of its mission as it was leaving the solar system and take a picture of all the planets just to show. And basically, it's all empty space with little specks of light. And this is our little pale blue dot right here. So I think that I'm going to just show you, a few little videos here. This is a flyby of the Messenger mission. It's a mission that went to go study Mercury. What I like about this is that it shows you, as you move farther and farther away, that the Earth is, you get to see many different faces of it, and you can imagine if all of that light was just condensed down to one little dot, you might be able to see it getting brighter and fainter. You might be able to see it changing color as continents come in and out of view. That's the only thing that we're going to have to work with when we finally are able to directly see planets around other stars. We're going to have to learn how to make maps of those planets just based on how the color changes and on how the brightness changes over time. But the Earth itself has many telltale signs of, if you make a rainbow out of the light coming from the Earth, there are many telltale signs, and we see, really strong signatures in the infrared and in the red where there's just light is just missing because water vapor is absorbing all of that light, and it tells us this is a water-rich planet. And then we can detect the blue sky in blue light. The Earth is very bright in the blue and then a lot darker as you go into the red. And we can even see plants. We can see signs of plants because they're very dark, actually, in visible light where your eyes are. They look green to you, but they're actually very dark. And then they suddenly become extremely bright in the infrared. If you had infrared eyes, all the plants would look white to you. They reflect all of that heat. So we can detect all of this stuff and potentially see it. We start with a little dot, and then we look at the color of light coming from it, and then we use that to create a model of what that planet might be like. And maybe it's like the Earth, maybe it's nothing like the Earth. But this is our job. This is what we have to try to figure out how to do, especially now that we have a new mission coming up that is going to have a coronagraph on it that should be able to, it's not going to take ultimately the most fancy pictures in the whole universe that we wish we could take, but it's going to be a really good start in the direction of where we want to go. These are some of the people on my team that are going to be working on this mission, and I just want to show you this picture because there's a human side to this. These are real people. These two guys are both at Princeton. I've been working with them for absolutely ever. And they're the two guys who are going to be overseeing my team, and I'm leading this team, but then we get to go to these two guys and complain every time we have a problem, and they have to fix it. And here's some of the lab work. So these are the guys, these are the engineers that are building this coronagraph. What a mess. I mean, there's just so many wires and optical elements, and it all has to be in a vacuum tank and simulating the space environment. And then I'll show you a little video of a new idea that we have been told. I've been really pushing for it for the last few years, and NASA has just mandated that we need to come up with a plan to use a star shade with the WFIRST telescope. And a star shade is a gigantic piece of plastic folded up like origami and launched into space and deployed in front of the telescope. And what it will do is it will align. It has to have its own propulsion system, its own control and communication. And it will align with a nearby star so that we can see planets orbiting around it. This is a totally different idea from the coronagraph. Coronagraph is like a regular camera inside the telescope. Star shade has to be outside the telescope and very far away. This is we're prototyping this in the lab, at the Jet Propulsion Lab. And so they're trying to figure out, how can you fold this thing up? Because it has to be huge, and it has to unfold without any imperfections, and then it has to maintain its shape. And believe it or not, this is actually a little bit simpler than the coronagraph with all those wires and optics and whatnot. But we're gonna try to do both and see if we can't accomplish some really neat science. The star shade actually would allow us to start seeing planets like the Earth around nearby stars. And let's see, so here's just kind of a picture of what that would look like flying in front of the telescope. And here's a prototype petal, the 3 people on my team. And these are actually very dangerous. Look at how pointy that is. You've got to be careful. And then they're trying to figure out how to use origami to fold it all up into a very small space. So I think I'm gonna leave you there, but I wanted to